Hello, this is Bob McClellan. This screencast is the third in a series about SpreadsheetML, part of the OpenXML document standard. If you have not seen part 1 of this series, you may wish to view it at the link shown. Also, there are no code examples in this screencast, but you can find those in other blog posts on openxmldeveloper.org. Just look for Bob M. In this part, I will show you how to work with pivot tables in a spreadsheet. So let's get started. This is the sample that I'm going to be using to show the organization of pivot tables and how to modify them. Here is the source data for this pivot table. It's pretty standard source where I have a number of repeating values in the first columns and then specific amounts. In the pivot table, I am showing the product in the rows and region in the columns. So you have north and south regions in the columns. And then I'm showing 4 different data values. If we look at this column, I've put in a formula to calculate the total from the quantity and unit price, and that carries through all the way down. So in the pivot table, I'm doing the sum of the total, an average of that unit price column, the sum of the quantity, and then I have the sum of average price, which is a calculated field that I put on the pivot table, and you'll see how that shows up in the SpreadsheetML. So next I'm going to look at this in Visual Studio. In order to do that, I have to close it in Excel. And then I'm going to open it in Visual Studio using the OpenXML Package Editor Power Tool for Visual Studio 2010. It's a very handy tool. It allows you to directly examine all the parts of the document. I'm going to start with the pivot table and work my way back to the source. So the pivot table is in this sheet 2. And I'm going to use a Control ED in order to reformat the XML to make it easy to view. And this will actually contain all of the data that appears in all the row and columns and so on that appear in the pivot table. But it doesn't contain any of the definition of how it builds the pivot table or how it refreshes it. That all appears in a linked relationship to pivot table, which I can find right here. So I'm going to open that, reformat, and so this has a number of important things in it. It shows the location of where it appears. And that location, the range right there, A1 to M9, will vary if you add more rows or filters. That can change. And then there's this list of pivot fields, which is a key part of it. And I'll be going over all these in more detail. But right now you can see there's a pivot field for each thing that appears. In this case, you can see like pivot table. This shows it's an axis column. That's the one that appears in the column. Then there's one that says axis row. That's the one that appears in the row. And then there's a number of data fields. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4 of those. And then after the pivot fields, there's also a definition of how the row fields are laid out. In this case, there's only one. These row items give it information about how the row items appear. I'm just going over this briefly right now. Then the column fields and the data fields. And you can see the data fields show their column names are defined in there, and so on. And then the style that I applied for the appearance of the pivot table. So that's all in there, so that can completely recreate the pivot table as it appears. So if we look back here, the style shows the colors and highlighting, and all the other information tells it how to translate from the source data, well, and along with the other pieces, which I'll be showing. But I'm going to show you a quick modification here. Let's say if we go back to look at the formatting for the average price and the total, the average price and unit price columns, or the average of unit price and sum of average price. Those two, the average one has 2 decimal places and the sum has 3. Or let's say the C column has 2 decimal places, the E column has 3, and I'm going to reverse those in the XML just to show you how that works. That's in this num format ID. So I have the average of unit price and sum of average price. I'll just switch this one to be 169, and I'll make the other one 166. So you can see how it affects. I forgot I have to have this closed when I'm saving it. Alright, so then I'm look at the results, and column C still has 2 decimal places and E still has 3. Why is that? Well, it's because we didn't refresh it. So let's refresh. Ah, there we go. So now it's affected. Well, we'd like that to update right away, but I'll show you how to do that as we go through these parts. In fact, it's going to be in this next part. At the beginning of the pivot table definition, there's this cache ID, and that cache ID refers to a pivot cache definition part. Now there's two relationships established to this pivot cache definition. The other one's in the workbook. You can see it appears in both places. This one in the workbook, and I'm going to open the workbook here, is where that ID comes from. Right down here in pivot caches, you see there's this cache ID that matches 18 here and 18 here. So that makes the connection between the pivot table and its cache. Now the pivot table doesn't really access the source data directly. It does it through this cache. And that's because sometimes the sources are from external, and they're external sources, they're not from the spreadsheet itself. So Excel still stores the data from the source in this cache for a pivot table, and it allows it to access it quickly and do the calculations it needs. So looking at this, we know that cache definition is going to be this part. I'll reformat that. And one of the things we can do here before I show you the rest of it is I can just somewhere in these list of attributes put a refresh on load. And then I'm going to save that. Open it up again. And you see it shows the change that I made right away. So that refresh on load is going to be pretty important if you're making any small modifications rather than creating a whole new pivot table. That's going to make a big, well, actually, even if you're creating a brand new one, the refresh really helps avoid having to do a lot of calculating of other pieces of this XML that Excel will do when you tell it to refresh. So what's in here? Well, first of all, at the top there's this ID. That ID refers to the cache records that it's going to use And then also very important is this cache source, and this source says that it's a worksheet that's the source, and then I have a named range that it uses. That named range, of course, is sales. Then after that, we have a series of cache fields, one for each of the fields in the source. These cache fields contain important information. I guess 3 different ways these are being represented. The first way has shared items with indicating its numbers with min and max values. That's what this first one is. Another one is the one that has a list of string values, like the ones for quarter. And actually, the year ones are mixed. It shows that it's an integer and it has a min and max value, but it also has a list of the specific values. 2010 and 2011 is being the distinct values that appear in that column. And the same with quarter and region. Now, category doesn't have anything in it because it hasn't been used in the pivot table yet. And later I'll show you how that gets filled out when we put it in there. Then there's product. Then quantity, unit price, and total are those integer types again, but they don't have the list of distinct values because they're being used as data fields, not as rows or columns. And then at the bottom, there are 2 calculated fields. Now the second calculated field, average price, is the one that I'm using in the pivot table, and it's calculated using the total divided by the quantity. The other one, average sale, I did by mistake. So I can't just edit this out in the XML without going and trying to find all the references to average price, because those references are indexed based on its order in here. But I can at least make it look less important. Let's go right here and say ignore instead of average sale. Or maybe, here even better, unused. So I'll save that. And now if I look over here, I can see unused in my list, so that then doesn't seem to be, it doesn't look so important, and it's not really a useful field because it was put in there by mistake. So you can see that I can make some really simple changes in the pivot tables just by finding the right properties here. As another example, let's actually change this to something else. Let's say I want to make this pivot total, and I'm going to try to calculate the total amount as I do in the source. I'll say unit price times quantity. I'll put so now I have a pivot total. I'll add that in, and it appears there. Oh, and it doesn't have any formatting, but that's a separate issue. As far as we could go and modify to add that data field as well, but I'm not going to do that right now. Let's look at the last part, which is the pivot records. A lot of parts in a pivot table. The pivot cache records. So this is a list of it's a copy basically of all the records in the source data. And you can see the count here shows that there are 60 records, which is what I have in my source. Look over here. You can see it goes to line 61, that with ignoring the headings, that's 60 records. But these records, you might notice, look a little strange. They use this X value and then 0, 0, 0 for the first 3, and then bicycles, and then another 0, and then numbers 8, 431, and 348. Well, the numbers we can see right at the top. look at the first record. There's 8, 431, 3448. So they're coming from that first row. But what happened to 2010, Q1, North, and B100? Those are all different, and yet they seem to have the 0 value in here every time. Well, what that 0 is, it's an index into the shared item values from the cache definition. So if I go back to the cache definition and look at the year, I can see that 2010 is in the first position, which is considered 0 in an indexing. When you have an index value, 0 is the first one, 1 is the second. So that means 2010, and I look at the next one, Q1 is the 0 index out of that cache field, and North is the 0 entry there. Category doesn't have shared items, so that's why it appears directly in the records. So that's why the zeros are all in there. Now if we look at the next record, we notice it's the first 3 are still zeros, then there's bicycles again, and then 1. And that means it's the B200 product. That's index 1. And so that's what we're seeing here, is the products go 100, 200, 300 mirrors, carriers. So we should see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then back to 0, but the region will change. So you have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then look, and the third value, it went from 0 to 1, and then we're back to 0 on the product. So this goes all the way down with all those rows. That's all that's in here. This is updated automatically whenever you do that refresh, like the refresh unload. So we just generally don't have to worry about this part, but I wanted to explain what's going on in here. Now, I'm going to, just to be sure, save what's in here, and then show you what happens if I put the category. Let's drop it in as a filter. So now this filter has the list of values there. And I'll save this. I want to go back here. It'll ask me if I wish to reload, which I do. I want to see the changes. Oh, but I forgot that I have to close this. So I'll open it again. So what's the change going to be? Well, in the pivot table, I should see something new. And here we have an access page. That's what it puts in for anything that appears as a filter on the spreadsheet. Then down in here, we'll also see there's a page field that is also in there. If I go to cache definition and look at category, now we have the shared items in there. If I go to the records, you can see the values for the category have changed, but look, interestingly enough, at the same time, it's removed the shared items from the quarter, which is not being used in this spreadsheet. So I hadn't seen that before, but evidently it decided, well, not using quarter, so just rebuild the whole thing without it. So you can see those shared values are very specifically used only for items that are actually appearing in the pivot table at any time. So it's calculating those all the time on the refreshes. So now I'm going to close this, and I don't want to save those changes. I was just looking at what had happened. I'm going to make my pivot back the way it was. So I'll take out the category and save it. The next thing I'm going to demonstrate is how to do a large change of this data. I'm going to actually manually add a new quarter to the source data all the way through here, and show how you could get new data in there and update the pivot table when it loads in Excel. So this involves adding to the original data in the source data. I need to add the cells there. I need to then modify the named range to include the new rows, and then update the pivot table. So I'm going to start with the source data. Now, adding source data can be a little bit involved. I need to essentially I'll want to copy the last 10 rows and then modify it to have the new quarter values in there. Now, I've covered this in part 1. The source data uses the shared strings table from the spreadsheet, and you can see those values here for like B61 is quarter 15, and C61 is a region, and that's, what is that one, 14. And so if I go over to the shared strings, I can go down to, right now I think Q2 is in there. This is an indexed entry. So Q2 is 15, south is 14. So that's what I'm looking at here with these values. So I'm going to want to change the B column from 15, which is Q2, to 16, which is Q3 on all the stuff I've copied. And then, of course, I have to change all the row numbers for whatever I've copied in. So I've done that in this little block of XML that I have saved off over here. So you can see I have row 62. My B column is being changed from 15 to 16. And then, of course, I've set up new values in the E, F, and G columns. So I'm going to take that and copy it and paste it in right here as new rows. So that gives me all my new values. However, remember that formula that I had in there? Well, that's being shared. You see this shared value here? That's being shared from way up at near the beginning when I started copying it down through. I think it's row 5. Right, so here's the original shared value. So I'm going to need to extend the reference range for that shared down to row 71. And I'm going to save that and take a look at it in Excel. So if I look at my source, I now have a Q3 for 2011, and it has a new set of values in there. So that part's done. But if I look at my pivot, these quantities I'll be looking at in the north updating. It's 59 now. That needs to update with the new values, and even if I refresh it, it's not updating, and that's because I haven't changed the name range. The named range is still not including those. So I'll go back here. Named ranges appear in the workbook. There's my defined name of sales, and I just have to include the new rows, my 10 new rows. I'll save that. And then I open it up again, and there it is. Now, there's still one more problem you may not have noticed. If I go back over here, this value right here, I updated the formula, but I didn't update the amount because I wanted Excel to calculate it. But it doesn't calculate it by default. So I need to tell it to recalculate. I'll go back, and that is found in the calculation properties here. I'm just going to add full calc on load. Now when I save this, open it, I get my 70. If I look at Q3 here, now you can see this total is changed. It's no longer 3318, which is what I copied. It's now 5214. So that's an easy way to get the, I've covered this in a previous screencast, but that's an easy way to get those formulas to update. So now the example where I changed this is complete. I've got my new calculated values, my new formula updating, and I've got this pivot table completely updating with the new quarter. So that shows how you can add new data to the source and have it show up in the pivot table when the spreadsheet loads. That's all I'm going to show in this screencast. In the next part, I'm going to go into even more detail about what's in the pivot, because I've only briefly touched on all those pieces, and also show more about modifying the layout, adding the columns and rows, page values or filter values, and data values. So stay tuned, so to speak.